Okay, hallo zusammen, welcome oder servus. I guess that would be probably the right way to start this session. My name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a cloud advocate working at Microsoft. And in today's session, we're going to have a look how you can manage your hybrid cloud environment using Azure Arc, and with that, Azure as a control plane. Now, before I want to start, I want to quickly explain a little bit what I do, because I often get asked the question, what does a cloud advocate do? And so on a high level, we do two things. We basically create and deliver content. So we create like docs, learn modules. We create blogs, videos, presentations, and deliver obviously these presentations like today. And another big part, and this is like really important, that is also why I'm telling you this, is we are actually gathering feedback, right? So we're not just an advocate for Microsoft in the communities, we are also an advocate for the communities within Microsoft. So we're really interested from our customers to learn what is working, what is not working, how can we improve, and then go back to our engineering teams, which are directly connected with us. Basically, we're part of Azure Engineering, and see how we can improve the solutions. And some of them we can probably fix. So if there's missing documentation and stuff like that, I'm happy to know. But then there's also stuff where we actually can influence the product as well. So again, feel free to reach out to me. If you have anything of that, I will try to then find the right person. So in today's session, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about hybrid cloud management. And I think this is, and it's not just hybrid cloud, right? It's also multi-cloud management. It's about everything outside of Azure. And we're going to see how we can leverage actually Azure management tools to manage all the rest of it. And I promise you, this session will be full of demos. So we're going to show, like I promise you, I will show a couple of slides at the beginning just to like bring everyone on the same page. But after that, I'm really just mostly showing you the product, going through what you can do and how it works, right? I know we have like 50 minutes, so keep the questions coming. I will try to answer them. If I can see them during the during the session, I will try to answer them then. Otherwise, I will just go in at the end and try to answer as much as possible. There's also a way that you can ask questions at Discord later, or even reach out to me on my social channels as well. So let's just jump right in. And again, I promise you just a couple of slides at the beginning to explain a couple of things and bring everyone on the same page. So first, talk a little bit about why we're actually doing this and what are the challenges we try to solve. So what we are looking at is we looked at the challenges of our customers they are facing today, especially with the combination of cloud computing and the growth of all what's happening in the industry. And we found obviously a couple of interesting challenges, but one of the biggest one is actually their environments get increasingly complex. And I'm sure you can absolutely relate to that as well. I think it never got easier. So this is definitely a challenge, and we want to help to address this. But to know what to address, we need to first figure out why is it getting more complex. So if you look at customer environments today, IT basically, and speaking of IT, this can be IT administrators, developers, IT teams in general. They manage hundreds, if not thousands of applications, right? They need to update them, manage them, but also deploy and obviously write them. And some of these applications are written in modern languages like .NET Core or other modern languages based on PaaS services or even serverless, containerized, and many, many more of these new technologies. But we also have this large set of traditional applications running inside virtual machines or even on physical machines. And we need to manage all of that. So this is obviously adding more complexity to it. The other thing we are seeing is obviously that customers have now a very diverse infrastructure. So they have their own data centers. They have some applications probably outsourced to hosters and local service providers. They have branch offices, factories, retail stores, other edge locations, if you will. And then we also see that they're obviously using different hardware providers. They have different hardware solutions as well if they're running their own infrastructure as well. So also that is a big challenge to obviously manage. And last but not least, what definitely makes the environment more complex is multi-cloud, right? And some companies They didn't choose a multi-cloud strategy. They just got in that situation where they're actually running multi-cloud. So I know a couple of customers, they actually chose Microsoft Azure as their main cloud provider, which is, by the way, an excellent choice. But they had already other departments starting with other cloud providers, and they're not going to just migrate like very quickly everything over, right? So they need to like basically have these both or multiple cloud providers on board. And in some cases, there's also a strategy behind it, right? You don't want to have like create dependencies to one of the cloud providers, for example. You like one Azure, one service better at another cloud provider. So there are many reasons why you probably would choose a couple of them. And again, depending on the company, this can make sense. However, would you be like for sure, it adds more complexity, right? I mean, if the cloud adds more complexity and one cloud provider adds more complexity, having multiple of these does definitely add even more. So we want to have a look at like how we can address this. And when we speak about all these challenges, I will use the word hybrid a lot. When I talk about hybrid, I'm not just talking about, again, like on-premises and in Azure. I really also mean like on-premises, Azure, other cloud providers, edge locations, and everything, right? So really, it's about managing any application on any infrastructure wherever you need them. So before we dive in how we can address this, I really want to make sure that people understand that this is not just something new for Microsoft. Hybrid was really built in from the start into Microsoft Azure, right? Many of you who were already working with Azure, they probably are familiar with things like Azure AD for identity, where you can sync your on-premises Active Directory identities to the Azure AD and then combine them, where you do a hybrid setup. The same thing for a lot of other stuff as well, like if you think about Windows Server or SQL Server as well. So, and we also obviously offered a large set of management tools, which already were hybrid. So we had that already. And I think why I'm showing you this slide, by the way, is first, like to understand that for us, there's not just one solution which means hybrid, right? We really have a couple of different solutions and services which should help our customers depending on what they need. And I will talk about that in just a bit. But for us, it's not just like Azure Arc or just Azure Stack. There are different use cases every customer has, and we try to provide like help all of them basically with our hybrid solutions. And why I'm showing you this slide really is this guy on the left side here. This is actually a picture from the keynote of Microsoft Ignite in 2019 in Orlando, where we still had an in-person conference. And he is Jason Sanders. He's leading all the engineering teams directly under Scott Guthrie, and he had the second keynote after Satya. And what he said, and that is why he's on this page, is he said, we think that hybrid is not we think that hybrid is an end state for our customers and not just an in-between state until everything is migrated to the cloud. So we're really seeing that customers need to have some sort of a hybrid setup. And this is not just going away, right, in the near future. So we need to address these. And there, again, as you know, there are many reasons why you want to have hybrid. You have, for example, existing investments in your local infrastructure. You're not just going to say, okay, well, we throw them all out, right? Then you also have like network challenges, like network latency issues, or you don't want to rely on your network connectivity to a cloud provider. Or you have challenges where in some cases you don't even have network connectivity, right, to a cloud provider. And then obviously the data sovereignty challenges where you don't have an Azure region within your country. And then you want to probably make sure that you can still like store that data within your country. And so there are many reasons why you want to do this. And again, we all know that this will be the case, and we will need to find a way how we can make that better. So I spoke about how we don't have just one solution, right? We have a large portfolio of hybrid solutions which help you to manage your hybrid, but also multi-cloud environment. So let's start on the bottom right. The session is way too short to talk about Azure IoT in that sense. But again, if you're dealing with IoT, we have a large set of IoT tools and services. The other thing I want to talk about is modernizing data center infrastructure with Azure Stack. Now, many of you are probably familiar with the original Azure Stack. But now, in the meantime, Azure Stack really became a family or portfolio of products, right? So we now have Azure Stack Hub, which is great, which is the original Azure Stack, if you will, which provides you with your own instance of Azure Resource Manager with an own portal, but you can use the same deployment techniques with ARM templates and so on to run that, for example, in a disconnected environment. We also have Azure Stack Edge to actually run machine learning and AI at the edge. And it's also a storage gateway. It's a first-party appliance you can order directly from the Azure portal. And then last but not least, one of our newest members is Azure Stack HCI, which is our hyper-converged infrastructure solution, which allows you to run virtualization workloads, really like from very small deployments, like with 2 node clusters in branch office, to very large high-performance deployments with 16 nodes. Huge capacity, huge performance. Again, if you go out and look for it, there's like a couple of great reasons why you should invest in that. And we also allow you obviously to run Azure workloads on top of this. For example, like what we announced is Azure Kubernetes service on Azure Stack HCI, which is currently in preview. So definitely check this out. But what we're going to talk about today is more about Azure Arc, right? And so we go to the left, and bringing Azure services to any infrastructure. That is one job Azure Arc does. So Azure Arc really provides us to be able to, for example, deploy Azure Arc-enabled data services, which in fact can be Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure Postgres on the customer's infrastructure. So we have, for example, customers telling us that they love Azure SQL. They really want to use it, but for some cases, in some cases, they can't use it, right? Again, I mentioned like network dependencies, like latency challenges or data sovereignty challenges. So what we're actually doing, if the customer cannot use the Azure service in Azure, we bring the Azure service to him. And I think that is one of the cases here. And I will talk about that, how that works in just a bit. And the other big part of Azure Arc is actually delivering that single control plane. And in fact, we're going to spend most of the time talking about this today, is actually how can you leverage like one single control plane to manage all of your resources. Doesn't matter if it's running in Azure, in your on-premise data center, at your retail store, for example, or even at another cloud provider, right? So if we look at Azure Arc, it really is about extending the Azure management and services to anywhere. And so there are a couple of use cases we can address today, and we will dive into these in just a bit. But one of them is obviously gaining central visibility, operations, and compliance control of your environment. So you actually can, like that goes where the management tools come in and others. But then another thing is also like bringing actually these cloud native apps and deployments to the on-premise world and managing them at scale. And then also, as I've just mentioned, run, for example, Azure Data Services anywhere. So let's speak a little bit more about this control plane, what we have with Azure Arc, right? And so you have Azure, and Azure offers a control plane to manage Azure resources, but Azure Arc really extends this to different cases. So one case is where you probably have existing Azure services or servers or Kubernetes clusters or SQL servers, for example. That's what we call the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure. So as like if you have existing Windows and Linux servers, again, doesn't matter where they're running, then you can connect them up to Azure and make sure they are basically becoming an Azure resource. And I will show you that in a bit. And it's not just about servers, it's also about Kubernetes clusters and existing SQL servers and so on. The other part is actually Azure Arc enabled services. That is where we actually bring down services from Azure, like Azure SQL Managed Instance, into your environment. And obviously they're also attached to that control plane. So that is what we're going to talk about. But better than speaking about it is actually jump into a quick demo. So I quickly switch here to the Azure portal, and I'm here on the All Resources page. So for those who are not familiar with that, again, I want to quickly give you a little bit of an explanation what is happening here. So as you can see, everything in Azure is a resource. So for example, what we have here is a virtual machine is a resource, or an object, a network security group, a disk, a database, and even an IP address is an object. And an object usually has a type. It's part of a resource group. It's joined to a location, and it's part of an Azure subscription. And I can use cool things like Azure tagging to actually then sort these and group these things as well. Now, a customer tells us like, okay, well, this is great, right? So we actually can see these resources. It would be great if I can also see my resources which are outside of Azure at the same place, right? And that is exactly what I want to show you. So what I'm going to do here to make it a little bit easier is I'm going to filter for Arc, and I'm going to join or just limit the view to my Arc service. So this means that we actually see our servers. I already joined by installing an agent on my machines. I see these. And I also want to see, well, let's say, well, I'm going to scroll down here. Also my virtual machines running in Azure. So I'm going to apply this. And now what I can see here is I can see all my servers, Linux and Windows, running inside Azure, but also outside of it. So you can see here we have virtual machines as a type. The blue ones, those are basically Azure VMs. But then you can also see I have a couple of servers here, servers like with server Azure Arc, and these are basically servers running outside of Azure. They could run at another cloud provider or in my data center underneath my desk here. So those are like the things I'm showing. And you can see here, these Azure Arc servers, they look like an Azure resource. In fact, they are now an Azure resource. They are joined to the Azure Resource Manager. So they are part of an Azure resource group. They are connected to a location. We'll speak about that. And they're also part of an Azure subscription. So I will show you how you can add these later. But now I can do cool things. Like I could, for example, filter and say, well, let's just do a filter of cost center and see what like servers are joined to that cost center. So I can select, let's say, I want to see all the servers for cost center 1001, 2, and 3. I'm going to apply this. And now you can see here that in this case, we have Azure Arc machines which belong to that cost center. Now you might say, well, Thomas, this is great, but like, okay, this show up in the portal, you installed an agent, but are they really an actual Azure resource? And I want to show you this, that they actually are. So what I can do here is I can go into Azure Resource Graph Explorer. I already prepared a couple of queries here. So what I can do here is I can see here a list here, the Azure resources, but I filter for Microsoft Hybrid compute machines. So just the Azure Arc machine. So if I run that query, you can now see that I have here all the Arc machines I just showed you. You can see, probably familiar with app 01 and DC01, which I just showed you in the view. But you can see here now they're part of the Azure Resource Manager. Now I can also do other things and say, well, let's just show me the Azure VMs and Azure Arc servers side by side. So in this case, if I zoom in here, you can see here, I can see my Microsoft Compute virtual machine as well, my hybrid machine. So if I run that query, you can now see that I have them side by side, and they're basically the Azure objects. Now, you say, well, Thomas, again, great, now I get the visibility, but I actually also want to do something. I need to like make sure that I can govern these resources or actually manage these resources. And I promise you, I will show you a lot on that. So the first thing I want to show you is policy. So if you drive into Azure Policy, for those who are not familiar with it, Azure Policy really allows you to manage and configure your Azure environment, right? So the example is that, the promise of the cloud is usually that you get this like huge tool set, you get like speed and agility, you can deploy new virtual machines or other services within seconds. And you as an IT administrators, or if you're responsible for the Azure environment as a cloud administrator, you need to make sure that actually the environment is configured in a certain way. And you also want to check that you're properly, like if you deal with compliance, you want to make sure that the cloud environment is compliant, right? So Azure Policy allows you to set, for example, policies to like limit the Azure regions your IT administrators and developers can deploy services to, because you probably want to limit to a couple of data centers. You don't want anyone just to deploy everywhere. You also probably want to limit the sizes of virtual machines, for example, deployed. You don't want everyone to deploy a MV2 series machines with a couple of hundred cores, a couple of terabytes of memory, and they drain your credit cards in like 3 seconds. So you can keep that control with Azure Policy. Now, another big part of Azure Policy is Azure, and not a lot of people know actually about this, is Azure Policy guest configuration. Now, this allows us to actually manage the operating systems and audit the operating systems within Azure virtual machines. And now with Azure Arc, even with servers which are running outside of Azure. Think about it as group policies on steroids for Windows and Linux servers, right? So how would I do that? I go to assignments, and I could then here create a new assignment. I can assign a new policy or an initiative. In my case, I will do an initiative. And initiative is nothing else than like a group of policies. So I then would select the scope. In my case, I just select my Azure subscription, but I could even go to a management group or to resource groups, down to a resource even. And then what I would do is I select the initiative. Now, you can build your own initiatives to like audit your environments and also like configure them. But we also offer you a couple of built-in ones. So if I look at the built-in ones, these are the ones you get free from Azure. There are a couple of them which are like technology focused to, for example, deploy prerequisites to enable guest configuration policies on virtual machines and stuff like that, or even like do a security benchmark. But then also we have industry settings. So Australian government, UK official, PCI, Canadian federal policies, ISO. And so this would then, like based on these standards, go out and audit your Azure environments, but also your virtual machines you have deployed in Azure and with Azure Arc, even outside of Azure. Now, to make an example how you would do that, I basically do a simple one, and I want to audit my machines and see if they have insecure password settings. So I would select that. And then obviously I would fill in and give it a better name for the assignment. I would obviously also add a description for it. But now what I can do with Azure Arc, on the next page, we got a new option here, which basically asks, do you want to include Azure Arc in connected servers? So in this case, I would say, yes, absolutely, I want to, because I also want to audit the policies or the password settings for these servers as well. So I would then go through this wizard and then at the end deploy it. And then it will take a couple of minutes to actually go out and audit all these servers. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cancel this. And in a good cooking show, I already prepared the next step. So if I want to see the compliance now of my servers, I would go to the compliance view. And what we can see here is a couple of different things here. The first thing you can see, I don't do a great job when it comes to compliance. You can see my environment is not very compliant here. You can see here all the policies assigned to my environment and where I'm not compliant and the resources I'm not compliant to. But then I have a couple of them where I obviously am compliant. So this is great too. So here is the policy I just showed you, the initiative to audit the insecure password settings. And as you can see here, well, it's really bad. So I really need to do something. And I can also figure out why this is. So I can see here the different settings, for example, and you can see here how many resources are actually affected by the different rules of that initiative. So these are all the policies here. But more importantly, actually, what I want to know is like which resources are these, right? So I would then go to non-compliant resources. And now what you can see here is I can now see resources which are Azure virtual machines, but also Microsoft Hybrid compute machines. So again, you can see here, for example, my domain controller, my local domain controller here, as well listed next to Azure VMs. So this gives me already a great tool set to actually go out and see if my environment is compliant. And again, I have a couple of them built in, but I can also build my own policies. So let's switch back to show you how that actually works. So this is a high-level view of the Azure management portal. And no worries, we'll go piece by piece here. So on the left side, we can see if we are, as an Azure customer, if we're interacting with Azure, we're basically using tools like the portal, PowerShell, the CLI, APIs, SDKs, third-party systems, and so on. And when we are interacting with Azure, what we're actually doing is we are interacting with Azure Resource Manager. And Azure Resource Manager is actually the magic behind like managing all these, these Azure resources, as the name says. It provides you with role-based access control. The whole subscription management is in there. There's also like the search, indexing, tagging is done by this. You get all the governance and policy stuff like logs and blueprints from there. And obviously it's also responsible for like deployments in terms of like, okay, all the ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager templates, or deploying extensions and so on. And then on top of that, we have different management services. So for monitoring, update management, containers, security, and so on. And in the past, this was really done by or available for Azure resources, right? And then you still had customers, as you can see on the bottom here, they still have an on-premises environment or a multi-cloud environment, or like both, obviously, and they would be happy. So they usually use tools like local deployment, existing tools like server admin tools and Kubernetes tools to manage these environments, and they can still keep on using them. However, what Azure Arc now does, it is basically the bridge between these resources which are outside of Azure and the Azure Resource Manager. So Azure Arc enables these services to show up as a native Azure resource in Azure. And then we get obviously all these benefits we can see here. We can enable these for our Azure environment. So what is Azure Arc enabled infrastructure? I talked about the stuff where you can already connect. So obviously we can connect servers. Again, this is a GA feature. We can add servers, Windows Server, Linux servers, running basically everywhere to our environment and manage these. And I'm going to take this as an example through the whole presentation. However, we also have the possibility to actually add Kubernetes clusters. Again, not just the Microsoft flavors of it, but also like general Kubernetes clusters. You can add, again, running on premises or even at other cloud providers to the Azure Arc and to the Azure environment. And then obviously we also support right now, for example, Azure Arc enabled SQL servers, where you can add your existing SQL servers to get some insights and security information on these configurations. Now, let me show you more and actually explain you how you can add these servers or Kubernetes clusters to your environment. And it's actually fairly simple. So I'm switching back to my demo environment here. And what I want to look at is, if I want to start with Azure Arc, I basically just go and search for Azure Arc here. And then it takes me to what I call, or what we call, the Azure Arc Center. So this is like the centralized place where all the Azure Arc stuff can be managed and configured. And you can see here I have a Get Started guide which explains to me how do I add existing infrastructure, how do they deploy, for example, Azure Data Services. So you can find all that information here. Again, on top, you also have a menu. You have also information. I highly recommend that button here, the Learn More button. There you find a lot of interesting links how you manage that. You can then also go on the menu here and list all your Azure Arc resources. So this is now basically the All Resources page, but just for Azure Arc resources. You can see here a couple of servers in here, but also a SQL server, a Kubernetes cluster, and much, much more. And that's actually what you can see here on the left side in the menu. You can see here I can add servers, Kubernetes cluster, SQL server, Azure Stack, HCI as well, which actually has Azure Arc built into like the operating system. I will talk a little bit about that a little bit later on, but this is also part of it. And then on the bottom, you can see here, if you deploy, for example, Azure Arc enabled data services, the way you do that is by deploying a data controller on top of a Kubernetes cluster. And this will then allow you to deploy actually other containers, which then provide you with Azure SQL managed instance and so on. So what I want to do here now is show you how you can actually add a server. So for server, I go to add, go to server, and you can see here I have listed my servers here. I can then simply click the add button. Now, what we actually need to do, and it's very simple, you don't need to go to that portal to actually add a server. It's actually downloading an agent, installing that agent, and then actually like registering that server using that agent to your Azure environment. So you're like to the right Azure subscription, to the right tenant, to the right resource group, so you can actually connect it. And I will show you how that looks like in just a second. But we want to make it easy for you. So we have these wizards here, these two wizards, which allow you to actually generate a script, which you then just simply can run on these machines. Now, the first one is really a simple one to just add a single server. So what happens there is at the end, when you register your machine, you will need to log in. You will need to provide an Azure, like your credentials with enough permissions to actually add a server. And this is not great if you want to add hundreds or multiples of servers at the same time. So that is where we have the option also to add multiple servers. And instead of using your credentials, you can just use a service principal with only, like, the only permission that service principal has is to add new systems to Azure using Azure Arc. And then you can generate that. To make it easy for now, to just show you the option, how it actually looks like, I will just generate the script for a single server. Now, the first thing I see here, I get an information, okay, on the prerequisites again. So as you know, you will need to have an agent installed on that machine. For that, you need local admin permissions. And then that agent will communicate to a set of Azure APIs on port 443. Again, you can find the outbound URLs. It's only outbound traffic. They're encrypted, obviously, to that. So it's not just general internet access, but it needs access to the Azure APIs, right? And then you obviously need, for the Azure environment, you need to have an existing Azure resource group where you can actually add these servers to. So if I click on the next page, this will now guide me to create that script. So I need to select the subscription. I will need to select a resource group. So I already prepared one here where I want to add my server. I can then select one of the Azure regions here. This is just where the agent connects to. So you obviously want to choose the closest Azure region for you. However, you can also, it's only about storing metadata, right? And connecting that agent. You could basically select, like, even if the server is running here in Europe, you could select Japan East. It doesn't make much sense. It's not like the ideal configuration, but you could do that. We then also have select, obviously, if it's a Windows or Linux machine I want to add. Now, this just is depending on, obviously, which agent are we installing, if it's running on Windows or Linux, and also how we generate the script. So with Windows, we get a PowerShell script. With Linux, we get a shell script. In my case, I've shown that with Windows. You can then add a proxy URL if your server is behind a proxy. And then you can add tags. Now, the tagging part I already showed you, for example, the cost center tags. We already recommend you a couple of tags here, like data center and locations. You don't have to use them at all. You can also create your own tags. And you don't need to add them right now. You can add them later if you wanted to. You can always also use Azure Policy to actually tag your resources as well, depending on different parameters. And then at the end, you get that script. You can download it, but we can also quickly have a look at it. So it downloads the agent, which is in the Windows world, is a MSI file, and then it installs that agent. And then at the end, we register that agent to the specific location and tenant and subscription. So again, this would take some time, and which we don't have right now. So I'm going to just show you how it looks like after I installed that agent. So I have a server here. This is our app 01 server. So if I do host name, again, you can see here that this is this specific server. I did already install the agent and register it on machine. Again, that server runs in my own data center underneath my desk here. So what I can do here, what's now happening is I have a process which is running. That is actually the process which connects now that machine to Azure Arc. And now I get also a new CLI. This is also, by the way, the CLI you need to run when you connect the server for the first time. So it's like Azure Connected Machine Agent. So if I write it correctly, by the way, that helps. So if I click on this, you can see here I get some more information what I actually can do. I can, for example, say, okay, let's do version. So it shows me the version of that. But more interestingly, I can also do a show, which then validates basically everything I just told you, that this server is now a resource name in Azure. It's joined to that specific resource group. It's joined to a subscription, a tenant, a VM ID. Now, you can also see that I have to list certain dependency states, which if they're running. So what I want to show you here, talk about this VM ID. By joining a server to Azure Arc, you get a managed identity, which is awesome. Like, you know that from, for example, Linux or Windows VMs in Azure, you can actually enable them to have a managed identity. So you don't need to store any credentials. So when they want to use Azure, when they want to authenticate against Azure Active Directory for your application or even for doing something in Azure, they don't need that. Like you can use that managed identity instead of like storing some credentials on it. And the same thing can you now do for your on-premises or VMs as well. So you can simply go and now take that identity to log in, for example, to Azure resources, like, for example, Azure Key Vault, and so on. So I'm going to show you something a little bit later on what we can do with that as well. So let's go back to the portal and now see how that resource looks like. So I have here that app01 server. If I click on this, we will explore a little bit what we actually can do. And as you can see here, it looks like an Azure resource. So there's no difference really how an Azure resource looks like. It's part of the Azure, of an Azure resource group, has tags here. You can see here I already added a couple of tags. And then you can see here, I can also see the activity log for that resource. I can also see the access control management, so role-based access control. So this is great now, because now, instead of like everyone seeing that server in Azure, I can limit like the view. So if this is, for example, a SharePoint server, and only the SharePoint's admins should manage that server, I can only give like the SharePoint admins to see that server. The same thing for the admins itself. They don't see all the other servers which are in their environment. They only see the servers they actually need. You also find some additional information here for the local stuff. So you can see here that this server here, you see the compute name. You can also see that it's joined actually to an Active Directory domain as well. Doesn't need to be, by the way, but it can. And then you can see here we can do a couple of other things here. So I did not enable all the services here. So I go to my WAC server here where I have a little bit more services available. So what I can do here is on the left side, you can see here I can do a couple of things. First of all, I have now extensions. So if you're familiar with Azure VMs, you know that we can actually deploy extensions, and we're using these also in the background, for example, to configure backup and monitoring and all that stuff. Now we can use these extensions also for Azure Arc machines. So one of the extensions would go out and install actually the log analytics agent for the log part. And the other one, for example, allows us to run the custom script. So if we want to run a script in that, we can directly do that from Azure as well. We also have integration into Security Center. So we now have Azure Defender for servers configured. And you can see here I get recommendations, security recommendations for that specific server as well. If I scroll down, I can even access log analytics here for that server. If I would configure that. And then I can also go and actually look at insights for monitoring. So if I go to performance monitoring, you can see here, I can see the disk performance, like how much like disk do I have, an overview of that. I can see the CPU utilization, the memory utilization. You can realize that this server doesn't do that much. You can also see the logical disk IOPS. So all the things you actually need to monitor, you can see directly from here. However, you can always go in and use log analytics to actually see all the performance metrics you need to know, right? If you have anything you want to know, you can actually use that as well. You can also transfer event logs, security logs, and much, much more. Now, what I also very much like is the dependency view. So this uses dependency agent, and what I can see here, if I zoom in, here is my machine, and I can see to which endpoints or server it's connecting on which port. So interestingly, this server here is connecting to 12 servers or 12 endpoints on the port 443. And you can see here where it's actually connecting to. Those are all public stuff. So for example, I can here also see that it's actually connecting to the Azure Arc API. But I can also see here port 4i3, which is a DNS port. I can actually see that this one goes to the local domain controller. So I can see all the dependencies of that machine. And obviously this is helpful when I troubleshoot something, or for example, if I need to do a migration of any kind. I want to know that all the servers which are actually working together. So if I don't know what is this application server doing, I can figure that out, what's happening here with that server and what is actually connecting to. I can also have a look at change tracking. So I can see all the changes right here happening to that server. Again, like if someone installs software or a service changed, I can see that as well. I can look at inventory, so I can see the software inventory. I can also search. So if I look for Edge, for example, I know that this server now has Edge installed. And I can do that for obviously also for registry and Windows services. I also want to quickly show the policy part. So I can actually have a look at the different policies, and you can see here, I can show you the policy I assigned to all of these servers. So before I was a compliance admin, I assigned that to my Azure environment or to my subscription. Now as a server admin, I can see, well, all the policies which are assigned to my server. And I can also see, well, I'm not compliant. So why I'm not compliant, I can actually see the policies or which I'm not compliant to and actually go out and fix this, right? So this is a view of the server admin. And I can also do update management. So super simple. I can see here which are the missing updates. You can see here there's a new version of the Azure Arc Connected Machine Agent that also is deployed using a Microsoft Update. And also obviously security updates. And that's because I'm not compliant now. So I can schedule an update deployment. I can give it a name. It automatically detected that this is obviously a Windows machine. And you can then configure reboot options. So reboot if required sounds like a good thing. I can now schedule it. So I could say update now. That triggers the update in like 5 to 10 minutes. If I'm going to schedule it, because again, I need to do a presentation right now, or we're doing during business hours, I can schedule it for later. And I can even create a recurring task. So it like says, okay, I want to run it every Tuesday at 8 p.m., for example. I can do that. I can say which updates should be installed based on update classifications, or I can also include and exclude certain update definitions. I can then run a pre and a post script if needed. And again, this also works obviously with Linux and Windows machines as well. And at the end, I would just review these settings and then basically create that update deployment job, which I'm not going to do right now. Again, still doing the demo. So you probably say, Thomas, well, this is great, but now if I have 100 servers, how am I going to do that? Well, you can also manage multiple machines because this is using update management you're familiar with from Azure in general. So if I go to the automation account with the update management solution. And here you can see here that I list all my machines here, which are joined to that update management solutions, non-Azure servers, but also Azure servers as well, Linux and Windows machines. And you can see here the compliance state. And here I could, again, schedule an update deployment and then also make sure that actually I can select a group of virtual machines or servers, because it can also be a physical machine, obviously. And then I can update them at the same time. I can even create dynamic groups and so on. So very interesting solution here. If you need to manage your updates across different environments, you can now easily do that using Azure Arc and the update management solution. So going back, before we are almost done, I want to show you something more. I want to show you Kubernetes cluster management. So if I go here, you can see here, I have already a Kubernetes cluster here. Again, looks like an Azure resource. I can use monitoring, as I showed you before, for example, Azure for servers. I can also use that for Kubernetes clusters. I can use policy as I can for servers as well. But I can do something additional, and I can use GitOps actually, so deploy applications to that Kubernetes cluster. So I already configured this here. So I can actually say, okay, this Kubernetes cluster now goes out and downloads my application here from a Git repo, and it pulls that every 3 seconds. Again, this is probably for production a little bit fast, but for a demo, I think this is just great. So let's have a look first here at the application itself. So this is what the application says. Again, I used all my web design skills here to design this. It says, hello, Azure. Now, let's have a look at the application about the code, about that Git repo I'm showing you here. And this is actually the code. So you can see here the YAML file, which basically configures that applications, where I also configured the replicas. And we made it super easy to actually set the message here. So we have it's saying hello Azure. Now I want to change this, and now I'm going to be a really bad admin. Like, don't do this at home, right? Don't ever go and do commit directly to your master or main branch. So I configure, I'm going to do this. I take all the risks here. I'm just going to change that to global Azure. I still do a commit message, obviously. But again, don't do that at home. This is just for demo purposes. So I do commit that change. And this will now obviously change the code of the application. And if I go back to the Azure portal, as you can see here, it's configured that it polls here every 3 seconds, as it just said, to see if there are any changes. And so what is happening now, if I go back to the application and I do a refresh, it changes now to global Azure. And obviously, this is not just about the message or the look. It could change the whole application, right? If I need more replicas, I can do that as well. And again, the power here does not really come by just managing one of these Kubernetes clusters. I mean, one is great to start, but think about it. If I have hundreds or thousands of Kubernetes clusters deployed with the same applications, I could easily go out and update all applications in a very fast time, centralized from Azure. And again, I can obviously set up, don't do it as I just did it, like go and edit the file like this, but you could actually set up a real, like using the DevOps process, using pipelines to actually also add approval steps and stuff like that for that. So you can make it really nice to deploy these applications to your Kubernetes clusters. Again, these can run on premises or even at other cloud providers. So one last thing I want to mention for the server before I finish up the presentation. One new capability I don't really have time to show you is to manage certificates on your servers. So one thing is obviously what we do on premises is we have the certificates and we use group policies, for example, to deploy certificates to all our servers. Now, in a hybrid cloud environment, servers, this doesn't really work. And servers sometimes are not even joined to an Active Directory domain, right? So what we can do here, and in this graphic, you can easily see that I can store a certificate into an Azure Key Vault. And then I can deploy an extension on these Arc-enabled servers. Again, works for Linux and Windows. And they can leverage the managed identity they now have to access the Azure Key Vault and pull that certificate down to their system. So this is really easy to do. Again, storing the certificate in the Azure Key Vault. And then you can also here then just deploy this extension. We don't have a UI yet to do that, but here you can just deploy the extension using a PowerShell code. Again, you can configure where it's stored, how many times the polling interval is, and so on, and which server actually you want to deploy it to. And then at the end, the certificate shows up on your machine. So we need to finish up. So let me quickly switch back to the slide here. Again, quick overview about the Azure Arc enabled servers. I showed you most with servers, but most of that also obviously works with Kubernetes clusters and other tools. So you get that centralized reach. So you can use Linux, Windows servers, VMs, physical machines, complete domain agnostic, running wherever they run. Now you can then organize your resources. You get an inventory. If you're a managed service provider, you can also combine that with Azure Lighthouse. So if you manage multiple customer and tenants, you can also use that. Azure Arc completely integrates into that. For governance and security, you get Azure Security Center, update management, Azure policies, and much, much more. And obviously, you get role-based access control. Again, like the things you get in Azure, you get also for these workloads as well. And then as I go back, I just showed you a couple of things Azure Arc can do. I couldn't really have time to show you around Azure Arc data services, but this is also great. If you want to run Azure SQL, you can do that as well. And then again, Azure Arc is not our only hybrid solution, right? We have a couple of solutions. So if you're into IoT, we have the IoT solutions. We have Azure Arc, obviously, as a single control plane, and obviously bring Azure services to any infrastructure. But we also have our Azure Stack portfolio with Azure Stack HCI, Azure Stack Hub, and Azure Stack Edge, which then can be combined, for example, with Azure Arc if you wanted to. So, for example, what you can do is like deploy Azure Stack HCI, deploy Azure Kubernetes service, AKS, on Azure Stack ACI and connect that up to Azure for example, for the GitOps configuration with Azure Arc. So you can combine these solutions, but if you don't have, for example, an Azure Stack, you can still use it with all the Azure other Arc-enabled features. So some really great stuff here, and obviously we're not done yet, so expect more announcements in the future, and obviously we're working on things like which you can try out in public preview, like SQL Server management or the Azure Arc-enabled data services. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend a couple of different resources. Obviously, join me on social and on my blog. You find a lot of different resources. We also have Azure Arc-enabled scenarios and automation as the Azure Arc Jumpstart. So if you go azurearcjumpstart.io, you can find a lot of different scenarios helping you with automation to deploy and try out these features. We have a great Learn module on Microsoft Learn, where you can go through the different configurations. It's absolutely free. And then obviously we also have the Azure Architect community where you can join. And we have a lot of guidance, for example, also in the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. So with that, I want to say thank you. I want to quickly look if there are any questions. Otherwise, I will go forward and hopefully see you online or in another presentation. So there's one question which comes up. How would you deploy different applications for Arc-enabled servers? Should I use DSC with script resources, or is there any easier way? So the question is really, I showed you how you can do that with Kubernetes clusters, but you can also do that of servers. So DSC is absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely the right way at the moment. This is like something you could do. If you want to make it easier, you could also use the custom script extension, but obviously DSC is much more elegant to use there. So I hope I could answer this question. I usually we get a lot more which you don't have time to answer right now. But please feel free to come to Discord and also join me on social and basically reach out to me. I'm happy to answer your questions. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the event.